Hey there, welcome to the latest Make It Monday video by Paper Tray Ink. This is Betsy Veldman here with you this week. We're going to be playing around with sentiment stamps this week. Most of us probably have a gazillion different sentiment stamps in our collection. Now usually those sentiment stamps kind of take up a focal point in our card. They're usually front and center. But today we're going to play around with moving them into the background and using them for some different background effects. So let's get started. So I'm starting off with some Fillable Frames 1 die cuts, which I die cut from Rustic Cream cardstock. And I'm going to start by just blending some ink around the edges. Right now I'm using tea dye. This is a Ranger Distress ink. The color is tea dye. And I'm just going to sponge that right around the edges using my ink blending tool. Once I have that done, then I'm going to move on. I'm going to use a little bit darker color. This is Walnut Stain. Now I'm going to use Ripe Avocado, and I'm going to go ahead and sponge some of that right around the edges over top of the tea dye ink. This is just going to be our base for adding lots of depth and lots of images kind of layered over the top of each other. Alright, that looks pretty good. Now I've got a couple more of these fillable frame die cuts that I already prepared in the same way. I already inked them before I started my video here. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to do all of our stamping. All of the stamps that I'm using today are from both Nativity Silhouettes and Nativity Silhouette Editions. Now I'm going to start off with a sentiment, the follow the star sentiment, and I'm going to ink it up with my Walnut Stain ink, but before I stamp it onto my die cut, I'm going to stamp it off once onto my scrap paper. Then I'm going to go ahead and position my stamp right in the upper right hand corner, and I'm going to allow some of that sentiment to kind of bleed off the edge of the page. And then I'm going to stamp it a second time without re-inking it. This just gives a real light impression, but it gives a lot of depth. Now I'm going to take a little star also from the set, and I'm going to ink it up with my Walnut Stain, and this time I'm not going to stamp it off onto my scrap paper. I'm going to layer it right over the top of my sentiment. Now I'm going to use my True Black ink, and I have my Shepherd stamp, and I'm going to stamp that in the lower left corner. I'm going to allow some of that also to kind of go off of the die cut, off of the edge there. So there's our first die cut. It's all completely stamped. Now you'll notice I did all of that stamping with just two colors of ink. I used the Walnut Stain and the True Black ink. All of the background was done with the Walnut Stain. It's just a variance in how many times you stamp it off before you stamp it onto your project. Here I'm going to use the same technique again. You'll notice I inked it up with my Walnut Stain, and I stamped it off once, and then I stamped it twice onto my die cut. And I'm going to add, you can always go back and add a little more if you want to fill in a little more space. You can just keep on going. Now I'm going to add in my Wiseman stamp. Inked it up with True Black ink. That's going to go in the lower right corner. Alright, and now I'm going to take that little star image again, and I'm going to ink that with the Walnut Stain, and again, not stamp it off. I'm going to stamp it directly onto my project and layering it over those stamped sentiments. Now we're going to move on to the center die cut. This is the one that's going to be stamped with the sunburst image along with baby Jesus in the manger. So I'm going to start with the sunburst, and I'm going to ink it up with my Walnut Stain, and once again I'm going to stamp it off onto my scrap paper before I stamp it onto my project. There we go. Now I'm going to take Baby Jesus in the Manger, and I'm going to ink that up with True Black ink and go ahead and stamp it over top of the sunburst image. And then I'm going to move on, and I'm going to take my sentiment that's going to just be real faint in the background, and actually I'm going to stamp this off twice before I stamp it over my sunburst. I want that sunburst image to be more of the more visible image of the two. So that's why I stamped the sunburst off just once before stamping it onto my project. But the sentiment I'm going to stamp off twice. And now I'm going to go in with a third layer over the top, and that is going to be the larger star, and I'm not stamping that off at all. I'm just putting it directly from the pad, from the walnut stain, onto my project. Now I'm going to ink up a Merry Christmas sentiment, and that's with walnut stain also, and that's going to be stamped full power as well. I'm not going to stamp that off either. I want that sentiment to be the focal sentiment on my project, so I want that to be nice and clear and dark. Alright, so our stamping is all completed. Like I said, it's just a matter of creating depth by stamping off and creating layers with the different shades of color. Alright, so now we're going to assemble our card. I have a 4 1/4 by 6 inch True Black cardstock base, and I also have some pattern paper from the Winter Flourishes and Swirls pad. I also inked the edges using the same technique that I used to ink my die cuts at the beginning of the video. Now I have a pattern paper strip. This is a 1 inch by 6 inch strip. This pattern paper is from My Mind's Eye. It's from their Lost and Found Christmas collection. I'm going to go ahead and adhere that kind of towards the bottom of that card base. Alright, then I'm going to add some foam adhesive to the back of my die cuts. Alright, so we have the foam all on. Just go ahead and peel the backing off, and I'm going to adhere them all right in a row across the front of my card. Go ahead and put the last one on, and we are all set. I'm just going to embellish that center star with a little gem, and our card is finished. I hope you enjoyed today's project and learned a few tips and techniques for maybe getting a new use from some of your sentiment stamps in your collection. Thank you for joining me today. I can't wait to see your take on today's technique. This has been Betsy Veldman for Paper Tray Ink.